The story begins in 1843 in Ascension Parish, Louisiana, where cotton fields bled into black swamps, and a silence hung over the land thicker than humidity. In those fields worked a man known only as Big Jacob, born in chains, baptized in blood, and feared even by those who owned him. Jacob never spoke, not as a boy, not as a man. Some said his tongue was cut out. Others whispered it had turned to stone from the horrors he'd seen. When the overseers shouted orders, he simply looked, and somehow they stopped shouting. The plantation house that owned him, Marrowbend Estate, was a place of rot and ritual, where prayers were said over bodies that weren't yet dead. And in that house, the masters had a secret buried beneath the chapel floor, a secret that would one day crawl out, wearing Jacob's silence. Most of the enslaved were known only by sounds: boy, gal, thing. But Jacob's name carried something else. It wasn't given, it was spoken by a dying woman. The old midwife, Ruthie May, whispered it on her final night, claiming it came from the swamp spirits, from beneath the water that never stopped bubbling. Jacob never looked anyone in the eye, not even her. Yet when she died, he dug her grave himself, 12 feet deep, in soil that pulsed like breath. The others said the swamp swallowed her name, and Jacob took it. After that, the masters grew uneasy. Jacob's silence wasn't obedience. It was something older, something that listened. The slaves began to say, "If Jacob looks at you too long, you'll dream of drowning." The masters laughed until the dreams began. At first, they awoke coughing, tasting mud. Then came the prince in the sugar house, enormous, wet, and leading nowhere. By spring of 44, the overseer disappeared. His hat was found floating in the bayou. The only sound the search party heard that night was breathing, deep, slow, and behind them. And in the morning, Jacob was at work, shirtless and calm, mud up to his elbows. In 1844, 9 plantation owners gathered at Marrowbend under a moon that looked like a half-shut eye. They came not for business, but for a ritual. Each of them, it was said, had seen something in their sleep, a tall figure standing at their bedside, dripping river water onto the floorboards. Their wives said it was a dream. Their preachers said it was guilt. But they all knew whose shadow it was. Big Jacob's silence had become a disease. It infected the air. The slaves moved differently around him, like men avoiding a grave they knew was open. The children stopped crying near him. Dogs wouldn't bark. Even the whip cracked softer when he walked by. So the masters made a pact, signed not on paper, but in blood and bourbon, under the chapel's cross. They swore that if one of them ever died by Jacob's hand, the others would take vengeance 100-fold. But oaths have power, and in that house of rod and psalms, something old listened. That night, the cross above the altar turned black with mold. The next morning, one of the master's wives found the packed paper folded inside her baby's crib, though none claimed to have written it down. 9 men had made a promise against a man who never spoke. And promises, in places like Marrowbend, never die quietly. In the slave quarters, children often slept in the rafters to escape rats and the reach of the overseer's boots. One boy, Isaiah, claimed he could see what others couldn't. He said Jacob talked in his sleep, not with words, but with breath. The kind of breath that made candles flicker and would sigh. Isaiah swore that Jacob's silence wasn't empty, it was full. Like he's listening to something we can't hear, he told his mother. Something that talks from under the ground. Then, one evening, Isaiah vanished. His mother found his small handprint pressed into the dirt behind Jacob's quarters, next to a second print, enormous, deep, as if the earth itself had grabbed him. The masters accused Jacob. They beat him with iron rods until the skin came off his back. He didn't scream. He didn't plead. He didn't move. He simply looked at each man, one by one, with eyes so black they reflected no light. That night, thunder rolled without rain. The fields shook. And in the morning, the swamp behind Marrowbend rose higher, as if it had taken something back. The boy was never found. But every night afterward, the slaves said they could hear him humming, high above the rafters. And Jacob, for the first time in his life, smiled. The cane fields glistened with dew that spring, but the sugar that came from them was different, darker, sticky, as if it refused to crystallize. The mill hands said it was cursed. The masters said nonsense. But one of the women boiling syrup noticed the steam smelled wrong, like rust and meat. When they drained the vats, they found bones the size of a child's finger, blackened and soft. The masters burned the batch and blamed witchcraft. But the old preacher who blessed the fields whispered that the land was taking tithe, that it was Jacob's silence feeding the soil. Soon after, a second master was found dead in his study, his throat crushed inward, tongue bitten through. The window was open, but the mud prints led into the room, not out. The pact of 9 was now down to 8. And though they swore to avenge him, each man began to sleep with a pistol by his bed and a Bible under his pillow. No one dared confront Jacob again. He worked in silence, his massive frame bent under the sun, eyes on the earth, as if listening for the next heartbeat to stop. The sugar never turned white again. A slave named Miriam, used to cleaning the chapel, found loose floorboards beneath the altar. Beneath them was a staircase, hidden, slick with moss. She told no one. That night, she followed the stairs down with a candle. What she found was another chapel, older than the house itself. Its walls were carved with strange marks, half scripture, half sigil. Bones were stacked like prayer books. And in the center, 9 rusted chains, each looped into the floor. It was there, long ago, the first owners of Marrowbend had made their covenant, to bind what they could not kill. Some said it was a slave rebellion they'd buried alive. Others whispered it was something older, something they'd brought from across the ocean and dressed in chains. Miriam ran. By morning, she was gone. Only her candle remained, still burning, upright on the altar above. From that day, the masters forbade anyone from cleaning the chapel. But Jacob was often seen standing near its doors at night, head tilted, as if he heard a choir beneath the floor. And when he walked away, the hymns that rose from inside were not in any language known to man. When the overseer was replaced, the new one, Mr. Keene, was meaner than most. He'd fought in Florida, hunted men for bounty, and called himself God's hammer. He didn't believe in curses or spirits, only in pain. On his first day, he whipped Jacob for working too slow. He counted the lashes aloud. 8, 9, 10. At 12, the whip broke. At 13, the handle snapped. Jacob never looked up, never flinched. Only after the last strike did he stand to his full height. Keene laughed, said, "That all you got, boy?" That night, Keene's body was found in the cane press, his spine twisted backward, eyes wide open, as if he'd seen something coming that no one else could. The coroner said his windpipe had collapsed inward, same as the others. The slave said the 9th lash had awoken the silence. And when Jacob came to the fields next morning, every man who'd watched the whipping dropped their tools and bowed their heads. No one spoke for the rest of the day. Not one word. By midsummer, even the air at Marrowbend seemed wrong. It hummed at night, low and constant, as if the land itself was remembering something. The masters called it swamp gas, but the enslaved whispered that it was Jacob breathing for the dead. Doors unlatched themselves in the big house. The chapel bell rang without a hand on the rope. Sometimes, a prayer would echo twice, once from the preacher's lips, and again, quieter, from somewhere underneath the floor. The remaining masters began to quarrel. Some wanted to flee. Others clung to their property like confession. Yet each night, as the wind passed through the fields, they said they could hear words inside it. A voice too deep to belong to any man, speaking scripture backward. Jacob continued to work in silence, his shadow lengthening over the cane rows. When thunder rolled, he looked toward the chapel, not the sky. Those who saw him said it was as though he was listening to a storm that hadn't arrived yet. And when the first shutters broke from their hinges, the wind that poured through carried with it a smell of old iron and lilies, the scent of the Marrowbend crypts. The fields were no longer growing. They were waiting. In the attic of the Marrowbend house was a small chest, locked, nailed, and hidden beneath ledgers of harvests and inventories. It was found by a clerk from New Orleans sent to audit the plantation after word spread of its misfortunes. Inside was a single journal, written in the same steady hand over 20 years. The entries spoke of ritual deaths, of prayers recited in Latin no priest had approved, and of a guardian of silence summoned to bind rebellion in flesh. The last page was dated the night the pact was made, and its ink was still wet. The final line read, "We have fed it enough to keep it sleeping. May silence never wake." The clerk took the book to town and never returned. His horse came back alone, reins soaked from the rain, and from something darker. That journal was never found again. But sometimes, when the wind turns cold through Ascension Parish, people still say a low, rhythmic whisper carries over the marsh, a recitation of debts owed and silence kept. The Mississippi near Marrowbend was wide and brown, moving slow but deep, as if dragging the years along its bottom. Locals said it had moods. Some nights, it reflected stars. Others, it reflected only darkness. Fishermen began pulling up strange things that summer. Coins melted together, rosaries without crosses, bits of brick engraved with symbols. And once, the carved handle of a whip, smooth as driftwood, initials gone. Each piece seemed older than the last, as though the river was coughing up history, returning what had been taken. Jacob often stood by the water's edge at dusk, unmoving. The others avoided him then. They said he was listening to the current for names. And on nights when fog blanketed the cane, the sound of the river carried further inland, not lapping, but murmuring, like voices remembering their own funerals. The masters boarded their windows. But silence, once invited, never stays outside. The Marrowbend mansion once had mirrors in every hallway. Within a month, all were covered with cloth. The masters' wives swore they saw movement in them. Tall, still shapes standing behind their shoulders, eyes too far apart, mouths closed. A guest from Baton Rouge removed one sheet, laughing at superstition. The next morning, the mirror was cracked from inside, as if something had pressed its face against the glass all night. Jacob passed the covered mirrors daily, his reflection never visible. Some said that was his curse, others said it was mercy. Soon the house grew darker. Oil lamps flickered out without wind. Footsteps echoed wrong, 2 beats after the last. And always, somewhere distant, that slow, steady breathing that no one could trace. The housekeepers refused to stay after sunset. They said the walls had learned to whisper back. And in a home that had once reflected every vanity, only silence now stared back. By autumn, the preacher at Marrowbend tried to bless the land. He gathered the few who remained and recited psalms until his voice broke. But when he reached "Deliver us from evil," the wooden cross behind him split from top to base, a clean divide. The congregation fled. The preacher stayed, trembling. He said the silence around Jacob wasn't demonic. It was answering prayer twisted back upon itself. He left that night and was never seen again. The chapel doors stayed open from then on, creaking in the night breeze like a throat trying to speak. Jacob worked still, day after day, the same calm, the same heavy breath. But the masters noticed something new. The earth around the chapel began to sink, as though it remembered the weight of what lay below. And the silence that had once belonged to Jacob now belonged to the land. The owners, desperate, set fire to the cane fields, hoping to cleanse whatever curse lingered. The fire burned bright and long, but by dawn, not a single stalk had turned to ash. The fields stood blackened yet unburned, the soot frozen like glass. They said the soil had turned against fire itself. The scent that lingered afterward wasn't smoke, but iron and lilies once more, the perfume of the crypts. That night, lightning struck the barn, and the entire sky glowed red for minutes. When the glow faded, every door on the plantation had opened, and the air was perfectly still. For the first time, even the insects stopped singing. Jacob, standing alone in the field, turned toward the mansion and finally moved his lips, though no sound came out. The workers who saw it swore his breath came out black, like dust from a forgotten tomb. And then, he went back to work. At dawn, the fields turned pale with fog. Then, without warning, hundreds of starlings fell from the sky, whole clouds of wings dropping soundlessly onto the cane. No flapping, no cry, just quiet rain made of feathers. The overseers tried to clear them, but the moment anyone touched the bodies, they turned to dust. The air smelled faintly of river water. For the first time, Jacob stopped working. He stood in the middle of the field and lifted his face upward, as if listening for something only he could hear. When the fog thinned, the sky above Marrowbend was completely empty. From that day, no bird crossed its boundaries again. The plantation became a place where even flight was forbidden that a traveling physician arrived to investigate the strange calm. His notes, later found in a courthouse archive, spoke of collective hysteria and marsh gases. Yet every night his handwriting grew shakier. He described hearing measured breathing through the floorboards and feeling pulses in the soil. On his 5th day, he recorded a single line. Silence is not absence, it is pressure. He left before dawn and never sent his report. The ledger ends mid-sentence, as if the pen had been lifted by another hand. Years passed. The estate changed owners, but no crop ever prospered. Families who moved and told of children who spoke softly in their sleep, repeating words in an old dialect none of them had learned. One mother said her son dreamed of a giant who guarded the quiet. Another claimed her daughter woke each night holding mud in her fists, whispering, "He's still listening." The local parish sealed the property, calling it unfit for habitation. Yet travelers swore they saw a tall silhouette moving through the cane whenever thunder rolled across the bayou. In 1911, a curator from Baton Rouge acquired artifacts from the Marrowbend site: broken tools, fragments of hymnals, and a single iron chain fused into a perfect circle. The exhibit opened for 1 week. Visitors said the air around the display case grew heavy. Audio recorders malfunctioned, photographs blurred. On the final evening, every label inside the case rearranged itself to spell one word: listen. The museum closed the room indefinitely. The artifacts were boxed and lost in storage, though employees still insist they hear faint breathing in the basement halls after hours. Decades later, a young preacher reopened the Marrowbend Chapel, declaring that faith must reclaim cursed ground. His congregation lasted 3 Sundays. On the 4th, he delivered a sermon about forgiveness, but midway, the bell above began to toll on its own. Each strike rattled dust from the rafters. Each echo grew softer, until only silence remained. He closed his Bible and said quietly, "Forgiveness requires confession, and the land has never confessed." He left the parish that night. The chapel door, witnesses said, closed by itself and has never opened again. In the 1950s, a field team recorded ambient noises from Louisiana plantations for a folk music archive. When they played back the reel from Marrowbend, they found a deep undertone beneath the crickets and wind, a steady human breath repeating every 9 seconds. Experts filtered the frequencies. Beneath the breath was a murmur shaped like a name: Jacob. The tape was sealed and labeled unusable, anomalous interference. But the archivist who cataloged it later confessed that the breathing continued even when the machine was unplugged. Today, Marrowbend is gone. The mansion collapsed, the chapel drowned, and cane grows wild over what was once ordered ground. Locals say storms avoid it. The wind bends around the fields as if respecting something still awake. When the river rises, people hear a low hum drifting through the reeds. Scientists call it resonance. The old folks call it Jacob's keeping. No one knows what he was, man, myth, or memory, but the lesson lingers. Some injustices don't vanish. They resonate until the earth itself remembers the shape of a voice that never spoke. And if you stand there long enough, between the ruined rows where sugar won't grow, the air thickens in your lungs. You start to hear breathing, not behind you, not ahead, but inside the ground itself. Big Jacob the silent. They whisper, still listens for the next promise broken.